It ends with a license tag. That's the final image of the story most people carry. Christmas morning, a warm room, a family gathered, and a stray dog wearing a new collar with a metal disc hanging from it. The 1955 film treats that disc as a reward. It is the visual proof that the wandering dog has arrived somewhere, that the outsider has been let in, that the story has resolved. For 70 years, audiences have read that moment as generosity. The house opens, the dog is taken in, everything the tramp lacked has been given to him. But the character who receives that collar was invented 6 years before the film began production in earnest, specifically to argue that collars were a con. He appeared in the February 1945 issue of Cosmopolitan magazine in a short story by a hard-boiled newspaperman named Greene, and in that story, his defining behavior is not romance. He goes among the pedigreed, well-trained, properly licensed dogs of the neighborhood, and he whistles at them because their owners whistle at them, and the dogs cannot tell the difference. They snap to attention, they perform, they obey a command issued by nobody from a dog who owns nothing and answers to no one, and he finds it very funny. That's the gap. Not gore removed, not violence softened, but something narrower and considerably stranger. A character built to expose obedience as reflex, handed a license at the end of his own story, and told that this is what he wanted all along. The man who built him is worth establishing first, because the register of the source is not the register of the film. Greene was born in Asheville, North Carolina in 1892. By the 1930s, he was a working newspaperman and a novelist of the tough American school. His 1936 novel Death in the Deep South is a book about a lynching and about how the law and the press behave around a murder. It was adapted in 1937 as the film They Won't Forget A decade earlier, in the June 1925 American Mercury he had published a piece called Notes for a History of the Klan. This was not a children's author. This was, rather, a man whose subject was crowds, institutions, and the machinery by which ordinary people are made to behave. By the 1942, Greene was the editor and general manager of King Features Syndicate, which distributed Disney's comic strips, and he wrote pulp fiction on the side. Happy Dan, the whistling dog, also circulated under the title Happy Dan, the cynical dog, belongs to that side of his output. Dan is not a lovable rogue in the modern sense. He is a dog who has worked out how the arrangement functions and declined it. The pedigreed dogs in the story have status, food, and shelter. Dan has none of those things. What he has instead is the knowledge that their status is contingent, their food is a payment, and their shelter is a jurisdiction. The whistling gag is not a joke about dogs being silly, it's a demonstration. Dan proves, on demand, that a trained animal responds to a sound rather than to a person, and that the affection the pedigrees believe they receive is a conditioning schedule with a nicer name. It's worth sitting with how precisely that gag is engineered, because it's the load-bearing element of the source, and the first thing the film discards. A whistle is not a word, it carries no content. It is a pure signal, and the only reason it produces behavior is that a human being spent months pairing it with food and approval until the animal stopped distinguishing between the sound and the relationship it was supposed to represent. When Dan whistles, he isn't imitating a specific owner. He's demonstrating that no specific owner is necessary. The pedigrees don't come because they're loved. They come because they were trained, and any mouth will do. However blunt that sounds, it is the story's actual mechanism, and Greene builds nothing else on top of it. That is a hard argument to make in a children's story, and Greene doesn't soften it. The dogs he's mocking are not villains. They're comfortable. They have the shiny collars and the warm rooms, and, in the story's frame, the good life and the joke turns on the fact that they experience their own conditioning as devotion. Dan is not cruel to them. He simply finds it funny that they cannot tell, yet the story does not correct him, punish him, or arrange for him to discover that he was secretly lonely. He whistles, they jump, he moves on. The magazine version has no interest in redeeming him, because it does not consider him damaged. There is one more biographical detail worth placing on the record, because it makes the trajectory legible. When the film came out in 1955, King Features immediately spun a minor unnamed puppy from the final scene into a newspaper comic strip called Scamp Asterisk, and the writer they assigned to it was Ward Greene, who scripted it into 1956 with Dick Moores illustrating. The man who had invented a dog to mock licensed pets spent the year after the film's release writing the licensed pet's son as a daily strip for the syndicate he ran. He was not overruled from outside, he was absorbed. Walt Disney read the story and reacted to it immediately, but not as social commentary. He reacted to it as casting. Since 1937, a story artist named Joe Grant had been developing a project about a pampered cocker spaniel based on his own dog, and it had stalled repeatedly. Grant's version had charm, but no friction, no engine, nothing pulling against the comfort of the house. A 1943 storyboard pitch survives from that period, in which the male dog is called Homer and is essentially a suitor. It didn't work. Grant could write comfort, but he could not write an opposing case, and a house with nothing pressing against it produces no story. What Greene's story offered was not a plot. It was an opposing worldview, already fully formed, that could be dropped into a house and made to argue. The account of the approach is well attested in Disney histories. Walt contacted Greene and told him, in effect, that "your dog and my dog have got to get together." He purchased the rights. Over the following decade, the studio pulled Grant's drawings off the shelf repeatedly and retooled, and by 1949, Grant had left the company without story credit on the film he had originated. The male dog cycled through names: Homer, then Rags, then Bozo, before Walt settled on Tramp, over objections from distributors who thought the word carried adult connotations the studio couldn't afford. Then Walt did something unusual. He commissioned Greene to write a novelization, and he had it published in 1953, 2 years before the film. Simon & Schuster brought it out as Lady and the Tramp, the story of two dogs, illustrated by Joe Rinaldi, with a foreword by Walt himself. The reason was commercial anxiety. This was Disney's first animated feature, not adapted from material the audience already knew. No Grimm, no Anderson, no Collodi, no Carroll, and Walt wanted a book in the world first, so that ticket buyers would arrive with the story already in their heads. The novel closely tracks the film. It is not the darker original. That is worth stating plainly, because the excavation here does not run through the 1953 book. It runs through the 1945 magazine story on one side, and the film's own production record on the other. Before we can understand what was removed, we have to establish the scene as it was left. What was left is a film of genuine and unusual accomplishment, and it should be credited properly before it's examined. Lady and the Tramp was released on the 22nd of June 1955 as the studio's 15th animated feature, and it was the first animated feature ever produced in CinemaScope. At an aspect ratio of 2.55 to 1, a wider frame than the studio had ever worked in, which forced the layout artists to rebuild staging from the ground up. Claude Coates, Al Dempster and Eyvind Earle handled backgrounds. 7 of the 9 old men worked as directing animators. It outperformed Cinderella at the box office and stood for years as the studio's second biggest hit. In 2023, it entered the National Film Registry. The spaghetti sequence is one of the most recognized shots in American animation, and Walt almost cut it. He thought it was corny, until Frank Thomas, who animated it, pushed back and won. The film is also not squeamish. This matters because the usual argument about mid-century Disney is that darkness was scrubbed out, and here it demonstrably wasn't. The rat is genuinely frightening, kept in shadow, killed off frame. The street dog attack is staged, in silhouette, and reads as brutal. And in The Pound, the film does something it did not have to do. A dog named Nutsy is led away through a door marked Cape Out, and the remaining dogs watch, and they understand, and so does the audience. He is euthanized. The film says so. The other dogs then talk about Tramp with real admiration and describe the life he's chosen as a short life and a merry one. Death is in this movie. Death is on the wall of The Pound. So the change is not a removal of darkness. The change is narrower and much more interesting. Look at what the production record shows the studio arguing about. The original screenplay killed Trusty. The bloodhound goes under the dog catcher's wagon wheel and does not get up, and the sequence was built that way. It was reversed during production, and the reversal is usually credited to the reaction it produced in the room. Peggy Lee, who voiced Darling and Peg and both Siamese cats, was reportedly distressed enough by the scene that Walt agreed to change it with the memory of what Bambi had done to children in 1942. Trusty survives with a broken leg. He appears at Christmas. Set those two decisions beside each other. Walt kept Nutsy's execution, which is grimmer, and cut Trusty's death, which is sadder. He nearly cut the spaghetti scene for being sentimental and kept it after an animator argued for warmth. There's a documented remark, recounted by Frank Thomas, in which Walt attacks his own story department for producing nothing but gags, 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 instead of a lullaby or a love story. The pattern is consistent, and it isn't squeamishness. The studio was not sorting material into acceptable and unacceptable levels of darkness. It was sorting material into what served the emotional argument and what didn't. Dampert Nutsy's death serves it. It establishes The Pound as a real jurisdiction with real consequences, which raises the stakes on Lady's collar. Trusty's death doesn't serve it, because Trusty's death would leave a cost sitting inside the happy ending, and the ending has a job to do. That job is the collar. Here is the comparison, held steady. In Greene's 1945 story, the stray dog's position is an analysis. He looks at the licensed dogs and sees animals who have mistaken a transaction for a relationship, and his whistling proves it. His freedom is not loneliness waiting to be cured. It's a considered refusal, and the story gives him no reason to revise it. In the 1955 film, the same character makes the same arguments. He talks about the collar as a limit. He shows Lady a night in which no one owns either of them. He treats the license as the thing that ends a dog's real life. The film lets him say all of it, yet it also gives him the best song, the best scene, and the audience's sympathy. And then it arranges events so that every one of his claims turns out to have been a wound rather than a position. That inversion is done with real craft, not clumsily. The film never argues against Tramp directly. Instead, it introduces the rat. It puts a human infant in danger. Has Tramp saved the child? Has him arrested for it? Has the household misread him? And then has him vindicated. By the time the wagon is stopped, his freedom has been converted into a liability that nearly killed him and a virtue that only the house can properly reward. He does not concede the argument. Instead, the plot concedes it on his behalf. In the magazine's story, a dog explains that ownership is conditioning. In the film, that same dog is shown to have been an unowned dog who wanted an owner, and the whistling, the entire mechanism of his critique, is simply gone. There's a second half to the inversion that's easy to miss because it runs through Lady rather than through Tramp. Lady begins the film as the pedigree Dan would have whistled at, a licensed cocker spaniel who receives a collar in the opening minutes and treats it as the proudest thing about her. Over the middle of the film, she loses it. She is muzzled, she runs, she spends a night unowned, and she is taken to the pound, where her collar is the only reason she is released while the dogs around her are not. The film could have used that sequence to make Dan's point for him. A collar is not a symbol of being loved in that scene. It is documentation. It is the difference between a dog who goes home and a dog who goes through the door marked "Keep Out." And the film shows us both outcomes within about 2 minutes of each other, but it declines to draw the conclusion. Instead of reading the pound as evidence that ownership is a legal status enforced by the state, the film reads it as evidence that being owned is safer than not being owned, which is true, and which is exactly the substitution. Greene's story asks what the collar does to the animal wearing it. The film asks what happens to animals without one. Those are different questions, and while both are legitimate, only the second one has a comforting answer. And notice what the film does with the fear it needs in place for that ending to feel like relief. The threat inside the house is not the family. It's Aunt Sarah, an outsider, and her 2 Siamese cats, drawn and voiced as a broad ethnic caricature, the sequence that Disney quietly replaced when it remade the film in 2019. Both threats are placed at the boundary. The house itself is never the problem, whereas in Greene's arrangement, the house is precisely the problem, because the house is where the conditioning happens. So here is the claim, stated plainly. The 1955 film did not sanitize its source. It reversed its source's politics while preserving its source's darkness, because mid-century Disney needed dissent to be reversible. The studio could show a dog being killed by the state, but it could not show a character being right to refuse the state's license. Nazi's death is permissible because it makes the collar look like protection. Trusty's death is impermissible because it would make the collar look like insufficient protection. The whistling is impermissible because it makes the collar look like a leash on the mind rather than the neck. The evidence for that reading sits in the film's own timing. Asterisk Lady and the Tramp Asterisk opened in June 1955. Disneyland opened 1 month later, on the 17th of July, and its entrance was Main Street, USA, an idealized American small town, which is precisely the setting the film had just spent 76 minutes making safe. The film is set in 1909, in a snug house on a residential street, and it was released to an audience in the middle of the largest suburban expansion in American history, an audience buying houses, taking on mortgages, moving into places with property lines and licensing ordinances and animal control. To that audience, a story in which the appealing outsider is proven to have secretly wanted a mortgage all along is not a fantasy about dogs. It's a reassurance about the arrangement they had just entered. The stray isn't a rebuke to the household. He's a future member of it who hadn't been asked yet. And the license itself was not a metaphor to that audience. Municipal dog licensing and animal control were ordinary features of American suburban government by the 1,950 seconds. A fee, a tag, a registry, and an impound facility for animals without one. The film's final image is not an abstract symbol of belonging. It's a compliance document handed over on Christmas morning and photographed as a present. Greene's Dan cannot be reassuring because Greene's Dan is not lonely. That's the whole difficulty. A character who is unhappy without a home can be given a home and the story ends. A character who is content without one has to be either refuted or removed. But the film chooses neither. It chooses the third option, which is to keep him, keep his charm, keep his voice, and quietly restage his contentment as a symptom. None of this makes the film dishonest. It makes it a document. And the document is unusually legible because Greene's original survives alongside it, so the substitution can be watched rather than inferred. A studio adapting Grimm is arguing with a dead German folklorist, whereas a studio adapting Greene in 1955 was arguing with a living crime writer it had on the payroll, and it won. The film gives the tramp everything he said he didn't want, and films it as a gift. The story gives him nothing he didn't already have, and treats that as sufficient. One is about a dog who is finally seen. The other is about a dog who was never confused in the first place. Both are stories about the collar. The film says the collar is what love looks like when it becomes permanent. The story says the collar is what obedience looks like when it stops being questioned. Neither version can hold the other's ending, and both of them are true about something.